Welcome to Building Research Relevance. My name is Stephen Shaw. I am the chair of the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology. And today what we're going to talk about is a little bit of a step to the next level compared to the open source analogy model, which talked a lot about how we can use relevance building research as a way to create theory, test theory, develop theory, and make our work as relevant as possible while still meeting the academic incentives. So here's another version of that. And this is a version that we use a lot in clinical work, which is taking ideas from other fields and applying it to the clinical fields. And this is something we do all the time. It's something we should do. Yes, we're stealing it from another field, but today what we're going to talk about is a perfect example of that. It's just referred to as hybrid research models. And Jeffrey Curran is the most well-known of the people who've really promoted hybrid research designs as a way to make research relevant. Now, he comes from public health. And in public health, it's really important to find not only an intervention style that works, but that can easily be used because they're talking about changing the behavior and minds of the public in general. This is always very, very difficult. But we have the same thing. When we create a clinical intervention, a therapy or a reading or an instructional technique, getting it done in a classroom is extremely difficult. Or having therapists engage and have uptake of a new idea is extremely difficult too. Different issues, but clearly in public health, implementation research is a big part of it. It's necessary. That kind of is a lot of public health. In our work, the emphasis is much more on what works rather than how to make it work. We need to kind of maybe up the implementation work here. But Jeffrey Curran has this hybrid research model, and it's more, I wouldn't call it a model, more of a typology and a way of thinking about research. And this can be extremely helpful for us as we try to make our research in education and psychology much more relevant to any practical purpose. Now, all he really is asking us is to think about things in a little bit different ways. And what he has is 3 types of research that are all what he would call hybrid research models. And like I said, I don't really call them models, but it's more of just a way of thinking and emphasizing different ideas. But the type 1 of his hybrid model focuses primarily on intervention effectiveness, but gathering implementation data. So this is kind of what we do now for the most part. When you have let's say you have a classroom math intervention. So you're going to implement it in a classroom. You don't really keep track of much of the implementation stuff typically. You only look about, is the intervention effective for a group compared to a control group that receives some sort of placebo or no interventions or is on a waiting list or some other way to define a control group that we'll talk about in future sessions. But the type 1, all he's really asking you to do is to do what you actually do, but give it some power. In other words, if you're doing this traditional effectiveness design, you're keeping track of how hard is it to teach the teachers how to do this? How far is it for graduate students to grade and develop outcome measures of the permanent products that are created by students? Is this difficult? Does it take a long time? We keep track of this stuff anyway, but often we kind of throw it away. It appears in a lab notebook that we all write to ourselves, but when we publish the paper, this information never appears. It's not even in our methods section at all. It's what are some of these little things that we had to think about to make it happen. Do we think that the kids liked what we were doing, or did they kind of ignore it and not really engage with it? We often don't collect those data formally, but we do collect them. And they kind of, like I say, they exist in a notebook of observations or random things that you saw when you were doing your intervention. But 100% of our focus is actually on the intervention effectiveness. What type 1 is asking us to do is simply take those implementation data, consider them, organize them, and keep them. And I think this is a great part about having all these online journals, is that you can often take these implementation data and put that into supplemental materials. So if you organize those in terms of how difficult was this to do? Did it take a lot of training? Did it take a lot of time? Did it take a lot of materials? Was it difficult to get teachers to do this in the course of a school day? Or was it difficult to get therapists to engage and get practice in this area? All of these things are often just ignored in our effort to see, did it work or did it not work? Did it work or did it not work is important, but just as important is how did it work? How difficult was it? If we're going to have relevant research, this is a key factor. So type 1 is kind of what we already do now, except give extra effort and extra organizational and archiving efforts to keep that information for you and maybe communicate that to others. I'll skip ahead to type 3 because type 3 is the inverse. This is when you have intervention effectiveness. You know something's pretty darn effective. But the primary question you're asking is, how do we get people to implement it? We see a lot of this in implementation science. This is kind of the essence of what they do in that field. But testing implementation strategies is great, but you're also collecting data on intervention effectiveness. Remember, implementation strategies are only important to the degree that they help improve the effectiveness of an intervention. They improve it because it's uptook. I don't think that's a word. But it's integrated appropriately into the day-to-day activities. It's used with integrity, or at least some form of that. And that's kind of the key factor. But we always have to look at, did it work? And so type 3 is the focus here's on the implementation strategy, but also collecting data on intervention effectiveness. Usually you use type 3 of the hybrid model. You're almost always using that when you know the intervention is fairly effective, but you're trying to see how we can best implement it and put it in place. So that's kind of the big thing there. Type 2 is actually the one thing that's fairly unusual, and that's a dual focus. They're seen equally as intervention and implementation. This is kind of hard to do, and I think the way I organized it in the open source analogy model makes a lot of sense for this, because you might have a proof of concept. Did it work in one situation under one context with one sample? Did it work? That's great. That's a type 1. Then I mentioned about having this implemented in multiple classrooms. That's a good opportunity to do type 2. You can tell I do classroom research, or it could be multiple therapists or multiple systems. You get the picture. But type 2, you have some evidence of effectiveness. Your effectiveness of the intervention component is really a replication, a conceptual replication, because you've already seen it kind of works. Now, does it work in other situations, other environments, other animators, all of this? And what are the factors of implementing it? Evaluating those two at the exact same time. So rarely do you take a new idea and go right to type 2, where you're equally evaluating them. And so, but this can be a growth. And we talked about academic incentives. Well, if you have an idea, a good intervention, I'm going to use this counseling technique because it's going to help with anxiety disorders in children, for example. And so the first time I see it's effective in a group of 15 kids who are receiving, some receive traditional CBT and some get this new advanced therapy, I see there's a significant positive difference. Awesome. That's type 1. What have you done to... It's only type 1, though, if you kept track of how hard was it for the counselors to implement this new idea. How much training did it take? How many sessions did they do? How many total minutes did they do? Keep track of that. That's your type 1. Type 2 would be focusing on different kids. It might be children of a different age, children with multiple diagnoses of ADHD and anxiety disorder, depression and anxiety disorder. Did the therapy work for them? And also really focus heavily on what does it take for a new person who's trying this therapy to engage in this idea. And then type 3 could focus on implementation strategies. Would this new therapy session, would it work well, not just for doctoral level psychologists, but do master's level social workers, do students, do physicians who are psychiatrists who are interested in using this new idea? Does it work for them? Does it work for multiple age groups? What are the factors necessary to adjust the implementation or the intervention for multiple implementation strategies and keeping track of that implementation? how hard is it to do? And so you can kind of see when you have an idea, it can go from type 1 to type 2 to type 3 as it evolves in complexity, and the implementation becomes more and more of a component when you know something's been effective. So this is an idea that comes out of public health, as I say, but it really is a fundamental way of thinking more than a series of research methods and designs. But it's a way of thinking to think about how is your research going to be used. If you have this idea, it can really work. It also meets the academic incentives of publishing a lot because you get multiple papers out of this. It shows that you have a coherent research strategy going in. You have a research program. This programmatic research is something that's very much valued by granting agencies. It shows that you have that in mind. It shows that your work is relevant. It helps you communicate to other people because you've done the relevant research to show exactly how things can be implemented. So this is something that we can use that meets all of the ideas. It also, by looking at implementation, it can actually help improve theories. We talked a little bit about that, the open science model. I'll talk about that in future sessions. But this is kind of a good way to borrow an idea from another subfield in clinical research, public health, and apply it to academic research that affects psychology and education. This is kind of how we do it and how we're working towards making research more relevant every day to help children, to help other clients in having effective outcomes. So look in Jeffrey Curran's work, Curran. He's done quite a bit on that. He's got new stuff coming out, and he does a lot of workshops if anyone's really interested in that. But it's actually a fairly simple model, but more to the point, it's a way of thinking about when you're doing intervention, you're also looking at implementation at the exact same time. This is the heart of clinical research, and this is something we need to emphasize more and more and more so our research becomes more relevant. Thanks very much, and I'll see you next time here on Building Research Relevance. Thank you.